September 2001. Sharon Stone is one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. She's just come off a decade of headline-making roles: Basic Instinct, Casino, The Specialist. She's 43 years old, and in an emergency room in San Francisco, a doctor is about to tell her that she has, by some counts, as little as a 1% chance of surviving the next few hours. She won't hear those odds from the doctor. She'll read them later in a magazine. To understand how far Sharon Stone fell in September of 2001, it helps to understand how far she'd climbed to get there. She grew up in Meadville, Pennsylvania, in a working-class family. By her own later account, it wasn't an easy childhood. She's written about a complicated, sometimes harsh relationship with her parents. And 2001 wouldn't actually be her first brush with death, not by a long way. As a teenager, she said she came within a 1/16 of an inch of her own jugular vein, an accident on a clothesline that nearly cut her throat. Not long after, she was indoors filling an iron with water, her hand on the tap, when lightning struck the well outside. It traveled up through the water line and threw her clear across the kitchen into the refrigerator. She said her mother slapped her awake and brought her back. By her own account, decades later, she's only half joking when she says she's always wondered what the next close call would look like. None of that stopped her. She was sharp and driven, and by the early 1990s, she'd become one of the most recognizable actresses in the world. Total Recall, Basic Instinct in 1992, which made her a household name overnight. Casino in 1995, opposite Robert De Niro. She wasn't just acting in these films, she was fighting for creative control. Most actresses of her era never got near. She produced 1995's The Quick and the Dead herself and pushed to cast a young, largely unproven Leonardo DiCaprio, reportedly paying part of his salary out of her own pocket when the studio balked. By 2001, she had money, fame, and a career at its peak. She also, without knowing it yet, had a torn artery in her neck. Stone has since written that her right vertebral artery, one of the arteries that supplies blood to the brain, had been torn to a fine shred, and that she was bleeding internally into her face, her brain, her head, and her spine. In her memoir, she suggested the chain of events traces back to an earlier medical procedure that year, surgery for benign tumors in her breast, after which she says complications began building toward the catastrophic bleed to come. She didn't know any of this yet. What she knew in the days leading up to it was that something in her body was going seriously wrong. The pain, when it hit, was staggering. Stone has described it as feeling like being shot in the head. She was bleeding into her brain for days before she ever reached a hospital. By the time she got there, she'd already lost consciousness. She collapsed, falling out of the vehicle she'd arrived in before she made it through the doors. This was late September 2001 at the California Pacific Medical Center in San Francisco. Doctors rushed her into a CT scanner. She remained unconscious through the entire scan. When she came to, she wasn't surrounded by chaos. She was somewhere worse, a completely silent emergency room. No nurses running, no machines beeping urgently. Just one man standing over her, inches from her face, stroking her hair with what she'd later describe, almost bitterly, as a stranger's kindness. She's written that in that moment she assumed, hoped even, that he might be someone who loved her. Instead, his next words were that she was bleeding into her brain. She said the silence itself is what told her the truth. When no one is rushing to save you, she's explained, that's when you understand exactly how serious the situation is. Even in the middle of it, there was a strange human moment. At one point, someone in the room panicked, and the doctor snapped at them not to touch her. The doctor then asked her gently what she needed. Her answer, by her own account, wasn't profound. She said she really had to pee. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of thing that makes the rest of the story feel real. The body doing ordinary things right up against the edge of dying. The numbers, once they came out, were staggering. Depending on the account, doctors put her chances of survival somewhere between 1 and 5%. Stone herself has said no one told her those odds directly. She found out later, reading them in a magazine. The plan was to transfer her immediately to a neurological hospital. This facility didn't have what she needed to save her. As the medical team moved her onto a transport gurney to get her into the ambulance, that's when it happened. By her own account, given consistently across interviews nearly 2 decades apart, she felt a sudden, unexplained sweep upward, and then
I felt myself kind of do this sweep upwards.
A tunnel made of light. At the top of the tunnel, she said, there was an opening, and looking down through it were people she recognized, people she had once been close to, people she had cared for before they died, looking down at her, the way you'd look down at someone standing at the edge of a hole. She's described the light itself as luminous, almost hypnotic. In her memoir, she writes that she wanted to know it, to immerse herself in it completely. And then, she said, it felt as though she'd been kicked in the center of her chest by a mule. Something snapped her back. And in that instant, she says, she made an active choice to survive. Years later, speaking with Anderson Cooper on his podcast, she went further than she ever had in earlier interviews. She said plainly, some would say she did die and was defibrillated, shocked back to life.
Was defibrillated and brought back.
The white light, she said, never really left her after that. It stayed with her on her shoulder, as she put it, a kind of permanent proof that she remains safe, even now. A quarter century later, she's also been candid that she doesn't need you to believe any one explanation for what she saw. Scientists, she's noted, tend to treat it as a scientific phenomenon. Spiritualists treat it as something else entirely.
I found out that I wasn't the only one who'd had this kind of experience. It's so profound.
She said she stands where Einstein reportedly stood, that it's probably both. Back in the physical world, doctors finally found what was actually killing her. Her vertebral artery hadn't just torn, it had completely ruptured. It took a 7-hour emergency surgery to fix it, where surgeons packed the artery with platinum coils to seal it off for good. The surgeon who saved her life was Dr. Michael Lawton, a name that wouldn't just fade into her medical history.
To Dr. Lawton.
He'd go on to become someone she'd stay connected to for the rest of her life. Here's the part of the story most retellings skip. Surviving the bleed wasn't the end of the ordeal. In a lot of ways, it was just the beginning of a much longer one. Stone bled into her brain for 9 straight days. That's long enough that, by her own description, her brain was physically displaced, pushed toward the front of her skull, no longer sitting where it had been before. The damage touched nearly every sense she had. She developed a stutter and for a period didn't even realize she was doing it. She lost directional hearing in her right ear, the ability to tell where a sound was coming from. Her vision changed. She's described seeing stretched shapes and drifting color patterns where there should have been solid walls. For roughly 2 years, she couldn't read at all. She lost a significant amount of weight during this period as well. On top of everything else her body was relearning how to do. The recovery, by nearly every account she's given, took more than 2 years of sustained grinding effort, and it cost her far beyond her health. Her marriage ended. She went through a difficult custody situation involving her son. Her career, one of the most in demand in Hollywood just months earlier, effectively stalled. She said it took roughly 7 years before her career meaningfully recovered. And then there was the money. Stone has said she had roughly $18 million saved from her years of success. During the long stretch when she was in no condition to manage her own affairs, she says people around her took advantage of that vulnerability. When she was finally well enough to check her own accounts again, she says the money was simply gone. By her own description, in the years immediately following the stroke, she went from one of the wealthiest actresses in Hollywood to having, in her words, zero money. She said she had to remortgage her own house just to stay afloat. Maybe harder than any of it was how alone she felt. Asked years later who actually showed up for her during that stretch, she didn't reach for a long list. She said her father was there for her, and that was about it. She's described hitting a genuine bottom during this period, feeling like her whole identity had been wiped out along with her health. And she's used one specific image to describe what came after, being burned all the way down to nothing, like a phoenix, and starting again from exactly that point. More than 2 decades on, Sharon Stone still talks openly about what happened to her in that San Francisco emergency room and about what she saw in the tunnel above it. She said she finds real comfort in knowing she wasn't alone in the experience, that when she started reading accounts from other people who'd come close to death, the parallels were striking, even across completely different lives, cultures, and circumstances. In 2021, she put the entire ordeal into her memoir, The Beauty of Living Twice, a title that refers directly to the second life she says she was given that September. The book became a New York Times bestseller, and critics noted it wasn't a typical polished Hollywood account. It was, as one review put it, brutally honest and restless. Stone narrating her own near destruction and rebuild in her own words, on her own terms. And it turns out this story didn't just end with a book. Remember Dr. Michael Lawton, the surgeon who performed that 7-hour surgery back in 2001? Stone now sits on the board of his organization, the Barrow Neurological Foundation, and hosts their annual fundraiser. Lawton himself has said she's become an inspiration to people dealing with neurological conditions of their own. It's a rare kind of ending for a story like this. Not just survival, but the survivor and the surgeon still standing on the same side of it decades later. And in 2026, 25 years after the bleed itself, she was still returning to it. This time on Anderson Cooper's podcast, describing the defibrillation, the light, the sense of permanent safety it left behind, not as a story polished for effect, as something she says she still genuinely carries with her. This has been Near Death Narratives. If stories like this move you, subscribe and we'll bring you the next one.